shipmates. I'm recording this during the time of the coronavirus, and I don't have a lot to do, and my wife won't let me leave the house to go sailing, so it's a good time to read a book or two. So I thought I would make a video and review with you some of my books on sailing that I have. Now, these are all what I might call storybooks. These are not textbooks on sailing. These are storybooks. But some of them do contain a lot of good information that a small boat sailor can use. So let me just point some out to you. Most of these are old, but I think most are probably still available on Amazon if you're interested. And then you can always email me if you have any additional questions. But I'll just step through these and give you my opinion of them. There was a guy, Tristan Jones, I've mentioned him before in a video, wrote this. This is his most famous book, The Incredible Voyage. Very entertaining book. A lot about sailing. The only bad thing about it is he was prone to stretch the truth and stretch it as far as he could, in fact. But nevertheless, it's an entertaining book. He lost a leg to diabetes or gangrene or something, and he wrote a bunch of books, but then he wrote this one, Outward Leg. I guess it's a pun on the fact that he lost a leg. But what it details is his conversion to catamaran sailing. He became a big fan of catamarans because he was sitting in a wheelchair and found it much more friendly for him than a monohull. Entertaining book. I wouldn't say you'd learn a lot about sailing from it, but entertaining enough. Now, 66 Days Adrift. This is about a guy that hit something off the coast of Europe and had to get in his life raft, and he floated across the Atlantic down to the Caribbean and spent 66 days living on his life raft. It's one of the 100 greatest adventure stories of all time. So very good book. Highly recommend that. You won't learn much about sailing, but you'll learn a lot about surviving in a life raft. The Greatest Sailing Stories Ever Told. Shackleton's in here. Entertaining, something to do, something to read on the weekend. Beyond the Blue Horizon, some more sailing stories. Tinkerbell, he sailed across the Atlantic in a tiny little boat. Entertaining, not much more, but entertaining. The Walkabouts, Family at Sea with a couple boys sailing around. Very good book, but once again, more entertaining than helpful. Hiscock, a very famous guy, Come Aboard, and then Southwest and Wanderer 4. Travel log books of him and his wife sailing. Good, something to read. Then we get into Lynn and Larry Pardee, Cruising in Seraphin, very good book. And then Seraphin's European Adventure, not so entertaining for us, but good enough for a weekend once again. Starbound, them sailing along. Pretty good book. But once again, nothing to brag about. This one is almost humorous in parts. Desperate Voyage. Right after World War II, this guy got a sailboat down in Panama and was trying to get to Australia back to his wife. And believe me, it was a desperate voyage. He went through a lot. Unfortunately, once again, I believe he tends to exaggerate on some of his adventures. But it is definitely entertaining. Survive the Savage Sea, about the Robertson family. This is a very famous book. They were hit by a whale off of the Galapagos Islands and had to get in a life raft, and they had a dinghy with them, fortunately. But there were several of them, and they managed to survive it. But very good book on, once again, surviving out there in the ocean. Okay, now we have Log of the Molly Brown by Richard Zantzinger. Okay, not a lot here. Read it for a little bit of entertainment. I don't think you're going to learn anything, but you know, what can I say? Now here's a more recent book, Taking on the World by Dame Ellen MacArthur. She was in the Golden Globe race or Vendée Global. You know, I don't know. I personally, with a 33-foot monohull from 1981, I have a hard time sometimes relating to these ultra high-tech boats and all the things that they do on these things. But, you know, it's entertaining enough. Her romantic adventures before she takes off are probably as entertaining as anything else in the book. Here's another Lynn and Larry Pardee Mediterranean adventure. I already mentioned the European and Cruising in Seraphim, but here's another one of their adventure books. Okay. A World to the West by Maurice Clofley, however you pronounce his name. Kind of an odd book. Not a lot on sailing as much as it is a travel log, and a good travel log. Particularly, they went around the world, but particularly all the islands of the Pacific they mentioned. Now, just as an anecdote, if you look real close on the boat, that's his wife, and I think she's totally nude in this photograph. Well, as I'm reading the book, I noticed something just a little odd. He makes a lot of references to sexual things in the book. And, you know, I'm a sensitive reader, I suppose, in that, you know, I read and I understand what's being said. And I noted that was just a little out of place in a sailing travel log. Okay, no big deal. Afterwards, I looked him up on the internet, and he was doing 10 years in prison up in Canada. After he got back, he went back to being a school teacher of little Eskimo kids up around Hudson Bay, and he got caught molesting little girls. So he was put in jail, and then he was subsequently deported back to New Zealand, where he was from. So, pretty good book and questionable author, okay? Now, I don't have the book. I got the cover. Cruising Under Sail. I keep this one on my sailboat. This is another Hiscock book, and it's, of course, it's old, but it's a very good primer on sailing. It's not an adventure story. It's how to cruise, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Another book, 500 Days Around the World in a 12-foot yacht. This guy made it himself out of aluminum. Serge Testa went around the world. Very good book. He tells you how he did it, how he survived the storms, how he cooked, you know, how he lived on the boat, and some of his shoreside ventures, I think, are in here also. I did hear this guy on the radio. He was in San Francisco giving an interview probably 20 years after he wrote the book. But a good book and very entertaining. I enjoyed it a lot. Now we get into some of the more hardcore stuff. Bernard Montessier, The Long Way. Very good book, very famous sailor. My only criticism of this book, you know, he's French. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but he tends to get a little wax poetic, so to speak, about him and the ocean becoming one and stuff like that. But it's a good book if you can don't get upset about that philosophical stuff. Close to the Wind, Peter Goss. This guy sailed alone in the around the world race, but he had to stop and rescue a guy, and could have very well have won the race had he not stopped. But it is a good book on sailing alone. My only criticism of this book, he spends 50 pages talking about how frustrating it was for him to find sponsors. Well, I wasn't too interested in that. Had I been his editor, I'd have said, hey, delete 50 pages. Now, Gypsy Moth Circles the World, Francis Chichester. This is one that every sailor, every small boat sailor needs to read. Very detailed. He sailed around the world, stopping once in Australia. This is a classic. A lot about sailing, how he did it. I highly recommend it. Every small boat sailor needs to get this book and read it well, several times. This is another good book, Alone Against the Atlantic, one of my favorite. This guy made a 10-foot boat in his garage out of 3/4-inch plywood and sailed or drifted across the Atlantic. Good book about how he did it, and being out there by himself in some rough weather, because he was in the Gulf Stream the whole way. But a good book. And then, of course, we have the classic Sailing Alone Around the World. It's a classic. It's a great book. But you're not going to learn much about sailing. He did all this, but he doesn't explain how he did it. He did this. Okay, well, how'd you do it? He doesn't tell you. For example, he got his boat to steer itself. Well, I'd appreciate, some ideas on how to do that, and he doesn't share any of that. Nevertheless, it's a classic and a great book. Now, here's another one every small boat sailor needs to get and read several times. A World of My Own by Robert Knox Johnson. The first guy to sail alone all the way around the world. He tells you everything he did, what he ate, etc., etc. Very good book. All his sail changes are in there. It's very much like this Gypsy Moth book. Very similar books in that they're very detailed on how they did it. Highly recommend it. Then we have, this book is long out of print. I found it on Amazon. He had a boat made, and a very small boat, and he sailed from San Francisco to Australia alone in this boat. He tells you how, this is his log. It's a short book. I actually read it in one evening. I'm a fast reader, but nevertheless, certainly 2 days would be enough to read it, a weekend. But very good book, very interesting. And one of the things I found most interesting about it was that he really liked to heave to. He was afraid of being ran over. So every morning at 4 a.m., he would turn into the wind, balance the boat, and go to sleep until 10 o'clock. Then he'd get up and take off again and stay awake and steer the whole time. So it took him forever. Why? Because he spent half the time, hove to. But nevertheless, a very good book. I highly recommend it. Very old. One of the first guys to go on a long distance cruise in a very small boat. Now we get to the last book I want to mention, and the one I recommend the most. The Venturesome Voyages of Captain Voss. He found an Indian dugout canoe up in British Columbia, fitted it out with 3 masts, and with a sailing partner, he sailed around the world in 1901. And he tells you once again how he did it. The sail changes he made, where the wind was coming from, how he dealt with the storms. I heard about this book first in Lynn and Larry Party's book on rough weather sailing. They mention it. And the reason is that he was one of the early proponents, and he talks all about it in the book, even in the back as an appendix. He talks about heaving to in a storm, turning into the wind, throwing out a sea anchor, backwinding a sail, and sitting there. And in this canoe, I think it's a 37-footer, he went through all kinds of storms, even a hurricane, I believe. He's got a couple voyages, and I tend to get him confused, but he definitely went through some really rough weather in this Indian canoe. Now, of course, There are the criticisms of it in that what applied to that boat may not necessarily apply to your boat or my boat. You know, heaving to, riding up and down the swells and the breaking seas to a sea anchor. Is that the right thing? Well, I nevertheless recommend reading the book, examining the evidence for yourself. Besides being very entertaining, his writing style is very similar to Slocum's. A lot of dry wit in his writing style, but he does spend a lot of time trying to help other sailors understand how he did it and why it works. So I highly recommend it. And Lynn and Larry Pardee, like I said, they quote a lot of this book in their book on heavy weather sailing. So, The Venturesome Voyages of Captain Voss. Highly recommend it. If you got any questions about any of these books, don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'll put my email address, sales@globazon.com, on this video. So yeah, find a couple of these books and sit back on a weekend and have a good read.